February 28th is a national holiday in Taiwan to mark the deaths during the 228 incident. Was it hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands killed? What took place on the island of Taiwan in 1947?
The reality is that we don't know because they were killed. And so, in that way, history is just the stories of people who survive.
The 228 incident was a massacre that spanned from February 28th to March 21st, 1947. Nearly 40 years after the incident, then President Lee Teng-hui designated February 28th as the 228 Peace Memorial Day, in memory of not just February 28th and the weeks that followed, but also the White Terror era that started 2 years later in 1949 and lasted nearly 4 decades. White Terror was marked by government censorship and control through fear, but today we focus on 1947. This park is the Taipei 228 Memorial Museum, which describes some of the causes that led up to 228. To understand why the 228 incident happened, we first must go back to 1945. At the time, World War II had just ended, and Japan had to conclude its 50-year rule of the island of Taiwan, then known as Formosa. The ethnic Chinese in Taiwan were ecstatic to be governed by its own people. Banners like this were set up to welcome the soldiers as they were coming in from China. However, the Chinese rule was not what they had hoped for.
When they came to Taiwan, a lot of horrible things happened on both sides. Like local Taiwanese looted businesses as well as Chinese soldiers. But the rule of law basically collapsed. All of this infrastructure, all of this discipline, and all of this wealth that was built up by the Japanese vanished within the 2 years.
Weston Wayne Cooper is a history teacher in Taiwan whose grandfather survived through the incidents of 228.
Taiwan became this place where there was cholera outbreaks, where food was in short supply, even though previously they supplied hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers stationed in Taiwan. All these Japanese soldiers left, and yet now there's less food than before. There were issues with Taiwanese people in their identity, right? Thinking that they're Chinese, asking for a government position and not receiving it because they were too Japanese. There were Taiwanese businesses that were being taken over forcibly by the government because they were Japanese businesses registered with Japan.
This room shows the economic situation in Taiwan at the time. Government monopoly and unemployment drove many Taiwanese to sell contrabands. 1945 to 1947 was like stacking firewood, and the confiscation of contraband cigarettes on February 27, 1947, was the match that lit it up in flames. The events of that day, like many darker parts of Taiwan's history, are still being investigated.
Even just like what happened on the 27th, like these two sources, we'll talk about it very differently.
Okay.
Right? Like this here is basically a primary source from what the KMT wrote. And this is just like an introduction and sort of a summary of all of the violence that happened at this time, right? And this was something that the government had recorded at that point.
Official record.
And so in these official records, you can see that they talk about it as these police officers looking for contraband cigarettes, gathered around them and like pelted them with rocks, and the rocks hurt Ling Jiangmai in the head, accidentally. Which then one of the police officers was forced to open fire in self-defense and accidentally injured a pedestrian. Without mentioning the fact that this was a 20-year-old college student standing in front of his house and that he died.
This account may sound unfamiliar even to Taiwanese because this is not the story that is usually being told. Government newspapers and radio at the time colored protesters as rioters, saying they were attacking government officials unprovoked. However, the unofficial records show a very different story.
They talk about it as very different. To say, they actually go in to say at 11 a.m. on that Thursday, on February 27, 1947, the Monopoly Bureau received a secret report that there was a boat in Danshui that was carrying a shipment of illegal contraband cigarettes, because at that time cigarettes were a government monopoly. And then it talks about these people that they didn't find enough. They were supposed to find 5 containers full, 50 boxes, and they found 5. And so they then were sent down to what is now Yanping Beilu, to that tea house. And they ate dinner, and then they went to the store. They ate dinner first and went to the store, and the dealers ran away. And then outside of the store, they saw a woman selling loose cigarettes. And so they attacked her, they confiscated her cigarettes. She grabbed one of them in the leg and begged, and they pistol whipped her in the head. And that's sort of the common story that we hear today.
So after that, there was several weeks of uprisings. There was violence against KMT troops, against the soldiers, etc.
Brian Hugh is one of the founding editors of New Bloom, an online magazine connecting issues in Taiwan and Asia Pacific to an international audience.
The people in Taiwan were reacting against the soldiers, taking control of buildings, setting up institutions of self-government in some sense, trying to make sure order was kept and so forth. And so this is what led Chen Yi, then the governor of Taiwan, appointed under the KMT, to request reinforcements from China. That's what led to the massacres that one then saw in the weeks after 228 itself.
Over the course of March, Chen Yi expressed his hopes for peaceful resolution, at least in front of the Taiwanese people. But behind the scenes, he sent telegrams to Kai-shek, who was still fighting Mao Zedong in China, asking for military support to suppress the rioters. When people talk about 228, they usually talk about it as an isolated incident, talking about contraband cigarettes and the protest the following day. But the horror, the massacre, that is what happened the following weeks.
March 8th was the first reinforcements arriving in Keelung at night. And if you go out to some of these areas where the military came down the ships and started shooting. And depending on what perspective you hold, the records were very different about this. And this is where things get really fuzzy, because the estimates of who died during these next week, basically hostilities ended pretty much by March 21st. So March 8th, first soldiers arrived, and by March 21st, most sources say that all fighting had ceased throughout Taiwan. What happened during this time is very hard to say. There are estimates as low as a few hundred, a few thousand people were killed, but there were other estimates that say as many as 30,000 people or more were killed.
.228 is a sensitive topic in Taiwan, and museums like this, the National 228 Memorial Museum, are helping people understand the history. But history is often colored by bias. Depending on your political stance, there may be a different account of what happened, different death counts, and even a different name, 228 incident or 228 massacre. For some, 228 is just a day off, but for many others, it's much more than that. It's 3 weeks of indiscriminate arrests, killings, and executions within Taiwan. It also symbolizes a group of people pushing back against an oppressive government.
The way it's often remembered is as Taiwanese people striving for self-determination in this form, to hope to actually govern themselves, because they felt that they had been gaining more self-control or more self-governance under the Japanese colonial period. And then when the KMT came over, they thought they would have more of that, but that did not happen. And so I think these uprisings then, that was seen as part of the attempt to kind of restore agency to themselves.
For many people, we take this as the time when this Taiwanese identity truly emerges. When people fully recognize that we're not Japanese and we're not Chinese. So what do we have to be? We're left with no other option than to be Taiwanese.
We're re-releasing this video on Taiwan Explained because the original version might have been a little bit more graphic than maybe was necessary. We strive to find a balance between conveying the violence that happened during that time, but at the same time making the video just as accessible. After the release of the video, we were actually able to talk to Weston's grandmother to get a recount of the incidents from her point of view. Her husband, Weston's grandfather, was going from Linkou to Taipei to sell coal, where he was arrested and nearly executed.
啊，讲吼唱要多容易啊，袂晓讲国语哦，我啊袂晓背册，了吼无迄边啊拍败，啊就甲掠去啊。 讲伊是歹人啦，手我搁举跳地数，
伊不要
啊
讲伊是
讲
地鬼头
哦
啊，
要摕去算杀啦。啊，拄好迄阵啊，迄个号做啊，白种时来啊，来讲看看讲啊，这毋是歹人啊，才无回来唱啥，讲查即满就来唱啥。